Hello, I'm David from Barclays.
He's lying.
I'm currently in the process of upgrading your account.
No, he isn't.
So I just need your full password.
No, he doesn't. It's a scam.
Once I've got that, I can send you a link to access the account.
That's also a scam. Every year, millions are lost to fraud. At Barclays, we'll never ask for your full password or PIN, so never give it out.
Thanks for your time.
At least that's true.
On Talk Radio.
Time to say a very good morning to Mr. Peter Hitchens from the Mail on Sunday. Peter, how are you?
Good morning.
I very much enjoyed watching your appearance on Question Time a little bit earlier in the decade, I suppose I would say. You look an awful lot younger, so all this worry has aged you, clearly.
Well, I was a lot younger. That's why I look younger. Now I'm older, I think older.
Yes, but
Normal
I mean,
process.
you basically, if I may summarise what you said, was you basically said that foreign policy, particularly in places like Libya, in places like Afghanistan, in places like Iraq, had failed dismally, was a complete and utter waste of time, waste of money, waste of lives. And you actually got a pretty good ovation from the crowd, not quite the same ovation from the rest of the panellists.
Well, the rest of the panellists mostly sat there looking dumb. But David Dimbleby, in one of his less sparkling performances, decided to make a joke out of the fact that I mentioned one of the reasons we were supposedly in Afghanistan was to suppress the growing of opium poppies, which is particularly ludicrous because at that time, I haven't checked lately, it's probably still true, huge quantities of opium poppies were grown in this country.
Yes.
At the time, I said it that, in fields near Oxford, where I live, which I visited, and all I got was, oh, would you grow it yourself personally? It was silly rubbish, but the whole point that I was making was that our supposed reasons for being there didn't stand up on any form of examination. And what were we doing? Nation building? Whatever. The other big problem has always been that the claim that was made that Afghanistan was being punished because it was the origin of September the 11th. Anybody who reads a tremendous book called The 11th Day by Robin Swan and another author, which I ceaselessly recommend, will see perfectly clearly, though the documents remain sealed, and I'm not going to answer any questions about what the truth is, that the origin of the September the 11th attacks was not Afghanistan, and everybody in the White House and the Pentagon and the CIA have always known that. It was a displacement activity. As for trying to build a nation in Afghanistan, the whole history of the place suggests strongly they don't want us to. But the really, really bad thing about all this fuss is that if you look back at the end of the Carter administration, right at the end of the 70s, you'll find that his Secretary of State, Zbigniew Brzezinski, was responsible for this operation to give Russia its own Vietnam. And in the course of that, the Americans collaborated with Saudi Arabia to fund and arm the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, who pretty much have become the Taliban. Yeah. We created this monster, which we now can't control. Our whole policy in there, everything that we did, what the poor British soldiers were doing, trying to build a sort of welfare state in Helmand province, was never going to work. And the reason why the Taliban continues to succeed is because there's never been a convincing central leadership in Kabul or anywhere in Afghanistan to fight them. We were totally unable, with huge amounts of effort and money, to create an Afghan army to fight them. But doesn't that suggest that there isn't really the will to do so? You don't have to be in favor of the Taliban to see that Afghanistan, as soon as outside power is removed, doesn't want the sort of government, or doesn't want it with any vigor, that we wanted to impose on them. And now you get all these people saying we should carry on intervening, we should stay. They don't mean we. They mean the poor bloody infantry. They mean young men from deindustrialized cities in North America and Britain who have to go out and get their limbs blown off and be shot for the sake of a policy which the people who propound it don't really understand. No, I don't know what they want Afghanistan to be. Honestly, if you want to go back to imperialism, then say so. Say we don't believe that people in large parts of the world can govern their own countries. We will therefore send troops and tell them how to run their countries. So these days, instead of sending them redcoats, we send them feminists. But that seems to be the view. But none of these people is ever prepared to stay for the long haul. They always plan to leave. And none of them is actually prepared to admit that this is what they're doing. Either you believe in self-determination and you believe in the end of colonial empires, or you don't. One or the other, not both.
Yes, and certainly it's been remarkably quiet on the feminist front, actually, since the weekend's events. Not many have been speaking up about the great taking over of nationalism by the people of Afghanistan, rather than they remain silent. But of course, I mean, I think many people now have come to the conclusion that Joe Biden came to, which is that the people of the United States of America are no longer interested in sending their young men and women to foreign parts for no apparent reason, as you say, to get their limbs blown off or to be killed. However, the method by which the pullout was organised seems to have been about as cat-handed as it could have been. I mean, who on earth leaves civilians behind working as British nationals and American nationals in a place that is likely to be taken over by the Taliban?
Well, I think it's poor intelligence. I think the CIA themselves thought it would be a matter of weeks before we reached the stage that we have in fact reached. They didn't understand that the Taliban were as well positioned as they plainly were, and were taken by surprise with the speed of their takeover. So you can explain that, but scuttling is always difficult to do because you're trying to maintain a sort of island of order in which you can get out without staying. And Britain is the veteran of many post-imperial scuttles, and they never end well. One thinks of two in particular. One, the partition of India, one of the worst disasters. We always praised ourselves for our imperial withdrawal, but it absolutely wasn't. And the other, of course, the scuttle from what was the Palestine Mandate in 1948, and the immediate war which followed between a newly born Israel and its Arab neighbours, which is pretty much still going on. If you scuttle away from somewhere you have been ruling, these problems follow. But at least at the end of the British Empire, we admitted that we could no longer afford to do this thing. What puzzles me is that we are now quite a poor country by comparison to what we were in our imperial days. But a country such as, say, Austria or the Netherlands or Denmark or Italy don't particularly bother with intervening in other people's countries anymore. But we still behave all the time as if we were a great power. We still have a great power nuclear arsenal, for instance. It's a huge Cold War monstrosity. We've got this ridiculous floating car park we call a target, which we call an aircraft carrier, currently sloshing about the seven seas for no discernible reason. We have enormous illusions about how important we are and how much difference we can make. Ultimately, when the Americans said they weren't staying, that was the end, and everyone should have understood that. And for us for politicians of this country to say, "Oh, we should have stayed, we've done a terrible thing," well, and then some ludicrous person has said that it's the worst crisis since Suez. Does he even know what happened in Suez? Suez was a problem where we intervened. We invaded in secret collusion with Israel. We invaded Egypt. And the Americans pulled the rug out from under us, as they so often do. And the whole thing collapsed. The thing which compares most with the Suez adventure is both the Blair's Iraq adventure and Cameron's Libyan adventure, both of which ended disastrously and which we still pay for. And, of course, the idiotic intervention in Syria, which has turned millions of people into refugees and tens of thousands of people into corpses for no discernible benefit. We keep doing this. Why don't we just learn? It doesn't work. It doesn't benefit people. If you're going to exercise your conscience in front of other people, then go and help in a homeless charity. Do something in your own neighbourhood. Don't start intervening in countries you don't understand and can barely find on a map.
But, of course, the problem with Afghanistan now is that if there are mass evacuations from Kabul, if people who live there and no longer want to live there decide they wish to become refugees, they will eventually head to Western Europe, and they will eventually end up probably on one of the beaches somewhere not a million miles away from Hastings. And so, we do have, I suppose, to look out for the collateral damage from whatever goes on.
Well, I suppose we do. This is a consequence of a foolish intervention which we flung ourselves into ill-advisedly 20 years ago and which we could have got out of a long time ago if people had only listened to voices, I'd have to say, such as my own, at a time when the departure would have been, I think, a good deal less disastrous. These things, of course, all the wars I mentioned pretty much, particularly Iraq, and Syria and Libya have hugely increased the vast migration problem, which the whole of Europe now faces. And these undoubtedly, if you go stirring things up in other parts of the world, it does come back to haunt you these days in very spectacular fashion. But that's not the fault of the people who are against the intervention. It's the fault of the people who intervened in the first place, in places they didn't understand and never had any plans to stay in. I have to say, when the Chinese do imperialism, they stick around. They're never leaving Tibet, and they're certainly not going to pull out of Xinjiang, where the Uyghurs are. They stay. They're among them. But also, the American empire is, of course, actually the 48 states. It's a huge land empire. This is one of the reasons they're not terribly interested in building up an overseas empire like the one that we have.
Sure, but what I'm saying is that, you know, in any situation, and if you look at Syria, for example, I mean, there would be Syrian refugees flooding over the borders to get away from what they believe to be persecution, whether or not we were involved in it. And I mean, I know that you have a particular interest in what's happened and what British involvement was in Syria, but there are some terrible leaders and some terrible dictators around the world who will inevitably cause people to leave their countries and search for freedom in the West.
Well, no doubt that's so. But the question of how many such people we can take in and remain the sort of societies that they wish to come to is another one, which I think probably is for another time, unless you've got 2 hours to spare. But
we may have to do a special section on that.
Here's another problem. I mean, take Syria, for instance, which intervention, not just Western, but also Middle Eastern, has reduced to ruins in many places. What we really ought to be doing is now helping them to rebuild, so that the refugees, huge numbers of them in Turkey and in Jordan and others further afield, can go home, which is what most genuine refugees want to do if they possibly can. But there's a great hostility to helping Syria rebuild, because the Western governments are absolutely determined on the overthrow of the Assad regime. They're quite what they want to replace it with. And here's another extraordinary thing. The people with whom we allied and who we helped out in Syria were pretty much al-Qaeda. The Nusra Front, particularly, which was our ally against the Assad regime, is very closely associated with al-Qaeda. And yet you get people who support the Syrian intervention weirdly saying how worried they are about al-Qaeda moving back into Afghanistan. Well, are they? What is their actual attitude towards this organization? Are they sometimes our allies, or are they always our enemies? And I don't really understand what the thinking is of these people. I don't actually think that they do think. I think they just sentimentalize and emotionalize, and it's from sentimental and emotional foreign policy, which, as I say, people try to exercise their consciences very publicly in other people's countries, that we repeatedly get these disasters.
Yeah, and I think you've sort of hinted at this before as well. There is a certain element of almost conceit, I think, with people like David Cameron, Tony Blair, probably George Bush as well. Much of their kind of foreign forays were done because they thought they could fix the world somehow.
Well, they do. This is the thing. It goes back to the amazing character of Mrs. Jellyby in Charles Dickens' Bleak House. People who are terribly concerned about foreign parts and other people's countries. Who, in the case of Mrs. Jellyby, couldn't even manage her own children. In the case of Blair, couldn't control or repress crime and disorder in his own country. It seems to me that charity begins at home. If you really want to improve the world, start as close as you can to home and move outwards from there. The idea that you can do it in front of TV cameras easily by intervening with jet bombers and tanks in other people's countries is proven again and again to be false. War, interventionist war, always leads to problems, both for the people who are being intervened on and for the intervener. And why is there no learning process in this? How many times do we have to bring disaster and turn these places into cauldrons of misery and bring some of that disaster home before we stop doing it?
Yeah, I know it's a terribly frustrating situation, but not one that we can easily find an answer to. Stay with us, Peter, if you would. We've got a couple of things to talk about. I want to talk to you about the education system, which you also wrote about this weekend. Peter Hitchens from the Mail on Sunday is with us, of course. Don't forget, we are now on TV.
Break of Mike Gray on Talk Radio.
Welcome back to the Independent Republic of Mike Graham right here on Talk Radio TV. We're talking to Peter Hitchens, Mail on Sunday columnist. And Peter, just as a sort of a slight swerve away from the business of what's going on in Afghanistan, which seems to be getting worse by the hour, Let's talk a bit about the education debate, because you wrote again about the A-levels this year, which once again have been awarded rather than earned. But you say it's the latest in a long sort of deployment of nonsense in the education business.
Well, it has to be because we fundamentally destroyed quality in our education system between 1965 and 1975, in a great revolution. I'm now writing a book about it, so I'm tediously knowledgeable about it. When the old state selective grammar schools were dissolved, this happened in England and Wales. Something very similar happened in Scotland, where they had a slightly different kind of selective secondary state school. But what basically happened was that the whole idea that we would have schools in which children from poor backgrounds could get first-rate education without paying was destroyed. What we replaced it with was an American system. Everybody knew when we did this that this would happen, or they denied that it would. The American system of neighborhood high schools, where if you live in a nice neighborhood, the high school is sort of okay. If you live in a bad neighborhood, it's pretty terrible. But in any case, the standards were vastly lower than those of the old British state grammar schools. And again, when I was going to school in the early 60s and mid-60s, it was generally stated that a set of English A-levels were worth the same as American college degree. And at that time, there was a thing called the brain drain, where the American universities and employers were plundering British schools and universities for the products of our schools, which were so much better than the products of their own high schools. And no one talks about that anymore because it's gone. What they had to do with the exam system was it got too difficult for the comprehensives to cope with. So in the late 1960s, they downgraded and watered down the O-level to the point where it became quite hard to fail. And then that wasn't good enough, so they replaced the O-level with the GCSE, which is a totally different kind of exam, nothing like as rigorous. And then this travelled on further up the scale, so that A-levels, which were once extremely difficult, rigorous exams, now aren't. And the universities themselves had to water down their degrees and, of course, water themselves down. There are so many universities now which wouldn't have qualified as universities at all in the 1960s, and they hand out first class and
we just lost Peter there for a moment.
The whole system is devaluing currency.
Yeah.
And what happened this summer, it seems to me to be likely to bring about the next stage, which is almost certainly the abolition of proper external exams altogether. Everything to be done by assessment, and of course that will be supervised by social mobility and politically correct commissars. So you'll never have an objective definition of whether somebody is well educated or not again. Well, that may suit people who don't do well at exams, but it's quite worrying in hard areas of knowledge such as medicine to think that the person who's treating you hasn't really been passing particularly rigorous or stiff examinations.
No, I find it very perverse as well, don't you, that people who have set standards and therefore have decided to improve those standards by making targets to hit, then work out that the targets are too far away to be hit, so then lower the targets and then lower the achievement level to reach that excellent target, and so excellence becomes meaningless. There is no such thing anymore. And I talk as somebody who went to a grammar school, so I know what you mean. It's now a private school effectively because they didn't wish to be turned into a comprehensive, and it's now independent.
That happened to quite a few.
So they're off. So they're off the market now. So even if they had become reasonably good comprehensives, they're no longer in the state system.
But the other thing is, because once the grammar schools have gone, there used to be in England about 1,300. In Scotland, I suppose probably a couple of hundred equivalents. And the England and Wales, 1,300. And so they were hugely dominant among the secondary schools. They were outdistancing the private fee-charging schools, the so-called public schools, overtaking them, for instance, in getting their pupils into Oxford and into the professions, and generally outdoing them in exams, because their standards were so high. What actually saved the British private school system and led to its expansion was the destruction of the grammar schools. But the thing is that the standards they set are no longer being there. Anybody can now, with these devalued examinations, look good without being good. My view is a lot of the private schools, which carry off huge numbers of A stars, and whatever the equivalent of A stars is now in GCSEs, are doing it because it really isn't all that difficult to do if you've got reasonably sized classes and parental cooperation with teachers. It doesn't require the sort of effort which getting proper A grades would have got 60 years ago. So it's deceptive. It's nothing like as good as it looks. But the fee charging schools look good. The remaining grammar schools look incredibly good, though they're nothing like the grammar schools that you went to. And there is a complete delusion about how good our education is. And in Germany, where they maintained selection by ability at 11, the educational standards are much higher. And in fact, when the old communist East Germany collapsed, they had an almost totally comprehensive system. They had a small number of selective schools, which you generally had to pass political tests to get into. When that collapsed, the parents in the former East Germany petitioned to have the grammar schools back, and they've got them back. And they're very good. And I've been to one. And what I found was exactly the thing you want. You have the children of doctors and of doctors in the same class, studying alongside, because they're both equally qualified to be there. And selection, as I say, is done by ability, not by money, not by what kind of house your parents can afford, but by how much you can benefit from education. And I don't think anybody looking at Germany can say it's a less prosperous, less stable society than ours, or one which has got more class prejudice than ours. But it still has pretty rigid academic selection in secondary schools over most of the country. We could do the same. It's not, as East Germany has proved, it's perfectly possible to put the clock back on this matter.
Absolutely right. And just one final question, Peter, going back to Afghanistan. I mean, there's a meeting, well, not a meeting, but a special session of Parliament happening on Wednesday. I don't hold my breath as to what's likely to happen there. But what do you think Boris Johnson should do?
Well, I think that the time has come for British Prime Ministers to cease to posture on the world stage, to recognise what sort of country we are. To say that what we should concentrate on now is defending ourselves properly. I wrote the other week about the terrible state of our basic Royal Navy, which is used to maintain about 50 destroyers and frigates to defend our coasts. And these are the fundamental workhorses of the Navy. It's now down to about a dozen ships. And we posture. We have, as I say, this ridiculous Cold War superpower nuclear deterrent, which is unusable, and we send missions to Afghanistan, but we can't defend our own coasts. To the extent as we see that we can't even defend the seas around our island from people who want to come here illegally. We really need to reassess our position in the world, recognise we're so obviously an important and significant country. They're not as rich or as powerful as we were, and to defend ourselves rather than go off on these ridiculous show-off missions, which do, as I say, far more harm than good. Yeah, that's what Wishy'd say. He's got the sense to say it if he wants to, but obviously he'll have advisors who tell him not to do so.
Well, we shall see. Peter, good to talk to you again as ever. Thank you very much indeed. Peter Hitchens, Mail on Sunday columnist, and making an awful lot of sense, as he has done for many years, not least on Afghanistan, not least on these foreign forays, which are inevitably doomed to failure. Another one is now doomed to failure. I've just been watching a piece of footage of what is going on at Kabul airport, where people are literally running alongside an American Hercules aircraft as it's about to take off, trying to jump on it from the outside. That's what's going on. That's how ridiculous it is. We'll be hearing from Joe Biden coming up. It's incredible what has gone on in Kabul over the last 24 hours. Absolutely remarkable. The fact that nobody saw it coming is even more remarkable. This is Talk Radio. Let's get some news headlines.